You think you know who owned California during the gold rush. Think again. It wasn't the miners who dug for gold. It wasn't the farmers who worked the land. It wasn't the settlers who built the towns. It wasn't the workers who constructed the infrastructure. Early California was owned by a small group of men who never swung a pickaxe, never planted a seed, never built a building with their own hands. They owned it through manipulation, corruption, violence, and a legal system designed specifically to concentrate power in their hands. While hundreds of thousands of people poured into California dreaming of opportunity, a handful of elites quietly grabbed control of everything that mattered. The land, the water, the courts, the government, the economy, everything. And they did it so effectively that most people didn't even realize they were living in an oligarchy disguised as a frontier. You arrived in California thinking it was open territory, free land for the taking, equal opportunity for everyone, the American dream. You were wrong. By the time you got there, the game was already rigged. The land was already claimed, often illegally. The laws were already written to benefit the wealthy. The system was already designed to keep you working and them profiting. This is the story of how early California became one of the most concentrated power structures in American history. How a few dozen families controlled millions of acres. How merchants formed cartels that controlled entire economies. How politicians sold a state to the highest bidder. How legal systems were weaponized against ordinary people. This is about who really owned California. And I'll give you a hint. If you were a miner, a farmer, a laborer, an immigrant, or anyone without significant capital when you arrived, you own nothing. You would never own anything, because the people who actually controlled California made sure of it. Let me show you exactly how they did it. California, 1848 to 1870s. Let's understand what was really happening. When gold was discovered in January 1848, California was technically Mexican territory. Within weeks, the Mexican-American War ended, and California became American. This timing was crucial. It created a legal nightmare that the powerful would exploit for decades. You had Spanish land grants from the 1700s, Mexican land grants from the 1820s, 1840s, then suddenly American law superseding everything. Overlapping claims, unclear boundaries, contradictory legal systems. The people who understood how to manipulate this chaos became California's first oligarchs. Before the gold rush, California had maybe 15,000 non-native residents. Most land was divided into huge Mexican ranchos, land grants given to prominent Mexican families. Then the rush started. By 1849, tens of thousands were arriving monthly. By 1852, over 250,000 people flooded into California. They came believing California was open territory, free land, equal opportunity. That was the myth. The reality was that powerful men were already moving to consolidate control. Here's what most people didn't understand. California became a state in 1850 extraordinarily fast. Why? Because statehood meant the power to create laws, establish courts, define property rights. And the people who controlled that process made sure those laws benefited themselves. The first California legislature was dominated by land speculators, wealthy merchants, and connected politicians. They wrote laws that would make them, and people like them, incredibly wealthy. They created a land commission supposedly to sort out legitimate land claims from fraudulent ones. Sounds reasonable, right? Except the commission required expensive legal representation, required navigating complex bureaucracy, required paying fees most people couldn't afford, required years of fighting. Who could afford that? Wealthy Americans with capital and connections. Who couldn't? Mexican landowners, individual settlers, miners, ordinary people. So the commission became a mechanism to transfer land from people who actually lived on it to people who could afford to legally steal it. Simultaneously, the powerful were grabbing strategic resources. San Francisco's harbor, controlled by a few merchant families who owned the docks and charged whatever they wanted. Sacramento's river access, owned by speculators who got there first and claimed the most valuable positions. Water rights, grabbed by mining companies and large landowners who then sold water access to everyone else. Timber land, claimed in massive parcels by lumber companies through fraudulent homestead claims. The best agricultural land, taken by speculators who bribed land office officials. This wasn't random. This was systematic consolidation of resources, and it happened while everyone else was distracted by gold. See, while individual miners were scrambling to find gold in streams, the real money was being made by people who controlled the infrastructure around mining. Merchants who sold supplies, bankers who loaned money, land speculators who owned the ground miners worked, water companies that controlled access, transportation companies that moved goods. The miners worked. The oligarchs extracted wealth from their labor. By 1855, the basic structure of California's economy was set. A small elite owned the critical resources, and everyone else paid them for access. This wasn't capitalism. This was feudalism with American characteristics. You had land barons who owned hundreds of thousands of acres, merchant princes who controlled supply chains, railroad magnates who would soon dominate transportation, political bosses who sold government favors, and you had everyone else, landless, powerless, working to enrich the people who actually owned California. This is the world you entered if you arrived in California during this period. You thought you were coming to free territory. You were actually entering an oligarchy. Let's talk about what daily life looked like when you didn't own California, which meant you didn't own anything. You arrived in California as a miner in 1850. You've heard about free gold for the taking. You're ready to get rich. First problem, where do you mine? The good spots are already claimed, not by individual miners necessarily, but by companies. Mining companies owned by wealthy investors who got there first or who bribed officials to give them the best claims. You find an unclaimed spot. You start mining. You find some gold. Now you need supplies. You go to the merchant. He's the only merchant for 50 miles. He charges you triple what these supplies cost back east. You have no choice. You pay. You need water for your mining operation. The water rights are owned by a water company. They charge you daily fees. You pay or you can't mine. You need to record your claim officially. The land office charges you fees. The official wants a bribe to process it quickly. You pay or risk someone else claiming your spot. You've been mining for a month. After paying for supplies, water rights, claim fees, and bribes, you've made almost nothing. But the merchant is wealthy. The water company is wealthy. The land officials are wealthy. They're getting rich from your labor. You own nothing. Let's say you give up mining and decide to farm instead. You need land. You file a homestead claim. The government supposedly gives land to settlers who improve it. You find a spot. You build a cabin. You clear land. You plant crops. You work for a year. Then a land speculator shows up with a document saying he owns this land. He has a Mexican land grant from 1842, or a prior American claim, or some legal document you've never seen. You protest. You've been living here. You've improved the land. You filed a homestead claim. He takes you to court. His lawyer is expensive and connected. You can't afford a lawyer. The judge rules for him. Why? Because the judge is friends with the speculator, or the speculator paid him, or the judge owns similar land and wants to establish precedent. You lose everything. Your cabin, your crops, your year of work. You own nothing. Or maybe you try to start a business in San Francisco. You need a location. All the good commercial spots are owned by a few wealthy families who bought up San Francisco real estate early. They charge you enormous rent. You need supplies. The suppliers are part of a cartel. They've agreed to fix prices. You pay what they demand or you don't get supplies. You need licenses and permits. City officials charge you fees, official and unofficial. You pay bribes or your permits get delayed. You're working 16 hours a day, but most of your revenue goes to rent, to the supply cartel, to official fees and unofficial bribes. The landlord gets rich, the suppliers get rich, the officials get rich, you barely survive. Here's the daily reality: everything you needed to survive was owned by someone else, and they charged you maximum prices because you had no alternatives. Land, owned by speculators and land barons. Water, owned by water companies. Timber, owned by lumber companies. Transportation, owned by shipping companies and later railroads. Banking, controlled by a few wealthy financiers. Supplies, controlled by merchant cartels. You couldn't escape this. You couldn't opt out. If you wanted to mine, you paid the people who owned mining infrastructure. If you wanted to farm, you paid the people who owned land and water. If you wanted to do business, you paid the people who owned commercial real estate and controlled supply chains. Every single day, you worked to make other people wealthy. You got up at dawn. You worked until dark. You did backbreaking labor. And at the end of the day, you owned nothing. You had nothing. You were barely surviving. Meanwhile, the people who owned California, who actually controlled the resources and the systems, lived in mansions. They imported luxury goods. They threw elaborate parties. They never did physical labor. They just collected money from your work. This was your daily reality. You were functionally a tenant in someone else's state. You could work as hard as you wanted. You could be as honest as you wanted. You could follow all the rules, didn't matter. The system was designed to keep you working and keep them owning. You would never accumulate enough capital to become an owner yourself. The barriers were too high. The system was too rigged. You were labor, they were capital. You were the owned, they were the owners. And that's how they wanted it. Every single day proved it. Let's get specific about who owned what and how they used that ownership to control everyone else. Land ownership was the foundation of power. By 1870, a few hundred families owned the majority of California's valuable land, not through legitimate homesteading. Through manipulation of the legal system. Here's how it worked. The Land Act of 1851 required anyone with a Mexican land grant to prove it before a commission. Sounds fair, right? Except the process was designed to be impossible for most Mexican landowners. You had to hire American lawyers who charged enormous fees. You had to travel to San Francisco for hearings, expensive and time-consuming. You had to provide documentation that might not exist or might be in Mexico. You had to wait years for decisions. Most Mexican landowners couldn't afford this. They lost their land their families had owned for generations. Who won these cases? American speculators with money for lawyers and bribes for officials. They acquired millions of acres this way. Then there were fraudulent land grants. Speculators created fake Mexican land grants. They bribed Mexican officials to backdate documents. They paid surveyors to create maps showing enormous claimed territories. They show up with these fraudulent documents and claim land that hundreds of settlers were living on. The settlers had no recourse. They couldn't afford legal fights. The courts sided with whoever had better documentation and more money. Huge land empires formed this way. Henry Miller and Charles Lux built an empire of over 1.4 million acres, making them the largest private landowners in America. They controlled water rights across the Central Valley. Any farmer who needed water paid them. The Big Four railroad barons, Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker, received 11 million acres from the government as subsidies for building railroads. They sold this land to settlers at high prices or rented it out. These weren't men who worked the land. They were men who owned the land and extracted wealth from people who worked it. Mining showed the same pattern. Early mining was individual miners panning for gold, but that didn't last. By the mid-1850s, the easy gold was gone. Getting gold required expensive hydraulic mining equipment, digging deep mines, processing ore. Individual miners couldn't afford this. Mining companies could. Wealthy investors formed companies. They bought up claims. They brought in industrial equipment. They hired workers at low wages. Workers did dangerous labor. They faced death daily. They got paid maybe $3 or $4 a day. The company owners got rich. They lived in San Francisco and eastern cities. They never went near the mines. The Bank of California, controlled by William Ralston and William Sharon, financed most of the major mining operations. They took ownership stakes. They controlled the industry. Individual miners became wage workers. They owned nothing. Not the claims, not the equipment, not the profits. Commerce was controlled by cartels. In San Francisco, a small group of merchant families controlled imports. They formed agreements to fix prices. They blocked competitors. If you needed supplies, food, tools, clothing, anything, you bought from them at their prices. You had no alternatives. They controlled the supply chain from ships to warehouses to stores. They made enormous profits. Miners and settlers paid enormous prices. Similar cartels formed in other industries: shipping, banking, insurance, utilities. A handful of wealthy families controlled each industry. They used that control to extract maximum wealth from everyone else. Labor was completely powerless. If you worked for someone else, in mines, on farms, in construction, in factories, you had no rights, no minimum wage, no safety regulations, no limits on hours, no workers' compensation, no unemployment insurance. You worked for whatever wage the employer offered. If you didn't like it, you were fired. Thousands of desperate people would take your place. Employers formed agreements not to compete for workers. They kept wages artificially low. Workers tried to organize unions. Employers crushed them using private security, police, and courts they controlled. In the 1870s, when workers struck for better wages, employers hired thugs to beat them. Police arrested the strikers, not the thugs. Judges ruled unions illegal. Workers had no power because they owned nothing: no land, no capital, no political influence. The owners had all the power because they owned everything. Here's the reality: California's economy wasn't a free market, it was an oligopoly. A few dozen families controlled land, water, mining, banking, commerce, and transportation. They used that control to set prices, to suppress wages, to eliminate competition, to accumulate more wealth and more power. Everyone else worked for them, rented from them, bought from them, paid them. The wealthy got wealthier, workers stayed poor. This wasn't accidental. This was the designed outcome. The people who owned California built systems to keep owning it and to keep everyone else from ever owning anything. Even healthcare and death revealed who owned California. Disease killed thousands in early California: cholera, typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, tuberculosis. But your chance of survival depended on who owned what. If you were wealthy, one of the owners, you lived in clean areas. You could afford good housing with proper sanitation. You could afford imported food. You could afford doctors. You still might die. Medicine was primitive, but your odds were decent. If you were a worker, one of the owned, you lived in filthy conditions. In San Francisco, workers crowded into tenements owned by wealthy landlords. These landlords charged maximum rent and provided minimum maintenance. No sanitation, no clean water, no ventilation. Disease spread like wildfire in these conditions. The landlords didn't care. They lived in their mansions in clean neighborhoods. Their buildings were just income sources. Hundreds of tenants died. The landlords collected rent from the replacements. The city health department could have enforced standards. They didn't. Why? Because the health officials were appointed by politicians who were friends with the landlords or paid by them. Profit mattered more than lives. In mining camps, workers lived in company housing. Crowded barracks, terrible conditions. Mining companies could have provided better housing. They didn't. Why spend money on workers who were replaceable? When disease outbreaks killed dozens of miners, companies just hired more. Labor was cheap. Lives were cheaper. Water told the same story. Clean water prevented disease, but water systems cost money to build. In San Francisco, a few wealthy families owned the private water companies. They charged high prices and provided poor service. Why invest in infrastructure when you had a monopoly? Contaminated water killed thousands. The water company owners got rich. The city could have created a public water system. They didn't for decades. Why? Because the politicians who'd have to approve that were paid by the private water companies. Medical care showed who had power. If you were wealthy, you could afford real doctors. They weren't great by modern standards, but they were something. If you were poor, you had almost nothing. Charity hospitals existed barely, overcrowded, underfunded, understaffed. Why were they underfunded? Because the wealthy who controlled city budgets didn't want to pay taxes for public health. They could afford private care. Why fund hospitals for the poor? So poor people died at much higher rates. From preventable diseases, from treatable injuries, from lack of basic care, workplace deaths revealed the same dynamic. Mining was incredibly dangerous. Cave-ins, explosions, equipment failures, thousands died. Mining companies could have implemented safety measures. They didn't. Too expensive. Workers were cheaper than safety equipment. When a worker died, the company paid the family nothing. No compensation, no support. The family starved or went into debt. The company hired a replacement the next day. Why? Because the companies owned the mines, the equipment, the claims. They had power. Workers owned nothing. They had no power. Their lives had no value beyond their labor. Hydraulic mining poisoned entire regions. It washed millions of tons of sediment into rivers. It destroyed fisheries. It caused flooding. It contaminated water supplies. Farmers downstream sued the mining companies. The companies had better lawyers and paid judges. They won most cases. Eventually, hydraulic mining was banned, but only after decades of environmental destruction and thousands of deaths. The mining company owners made fortunes. The workers and downstream communities paid the price. This pattern extended everywhere. Railroad construction killed thousands of workers, especially Chinese laborers doing the most dangerous work. The railroad barons became some of America's wealthiest men. Factory accidents killed workers regularly. Factory owners paid nothing. Agricultural labor destroyed people's health. Landowners paid subsistence wages. In early California, if you owned resources and companies, your life was secure. Your family was protected. Your future was comfortable. If you only owned your labor, your life was expendable. Your death meant nothing. You'd be replaced immediately. The people who actually owned California, the land, the companies, the infrastructure, had the power to protect themselves and their families. Everyone else was disposable. The legal system proved most clearly who owned California, because the people who owned the state literally owned the justice system. Let me show you exactly how this worked. Judges in early California were often appointed by governors who were themselves controlled by wealthy interests. Or judges were elected in elections that wealthy men financed. Either way, judges understood who they served. Not justice, not the people, the wealthy who controlled their positions. So court decisions reflected power, not law. Here's a typical land case. A settler lived on land for years, built a home, cleared fields, planted crops. A wealthy speculator showed up with a questionable land grant claiming ownership. They went to court. The speculator had expensive lawyers. The settler represented himself or had a cheap lawyer. The judge ruled for the speculator. Why? Sometimes because the speculator's legal team was genuinely better at manipulating complex land law. Sometimes because the judge was friends with the speculator. Sometimes because the speculator paid the judge. The settler lost everything. The speculator added more land to his empire. This happened thousands of times. The courts became mechanisms for transferring land from people who worked it to people who owned capital. Criminal justice was worse. If you were wealthy and committed a crime, even murder, you rarely faced serious consequences. You hired the best lawyers. You paid bribes. You used your connections. You walked free. If you were poor and committed a crime or were just accused, you were convicted. You couldn't afford lawyers. You couldn't pay bribes. You had no connection. The system crushed you. This created a two-tier justice system, one for owners, one for everyone else. Police worked for the owners too. In San Francisco, the police were essentially a private security force for wealthy interests. They protected wealthy neighborhoods. They left poor neighborhoods unpoliced. They broke strikes. They evicted tenants. They removed squatters from land wealthy people wanted. They didn't serve the public. They served power. When workers organized for better wages, police arrested them. When companies hired thugs to beat workers, police watched. The police chief was appointed by politicians controlled by wealthy businessmen. He understood his real employers. Vigilante justice emerged partly because people realized the official system served only the wealthy. In 1851 and 1856, San Francisco's vigilance committees formed. They arrested people, held trials, and hanged criminals. This was mob justice, dangerous and wrong. But it happened because people saw that official justice only protected the wealthy, so they took matters into their own hands. The violence showed who had power too. Wealthy landowners hired private armies to drive settlers off land they claimed. The settlers had no protection. The law sided with the landowners. The railroad companies used violence to grab land. They hired gunmen. They intimidated farmers. They destroyed property. When farmers fought back, the railroad companies used their political connections to prosecute the farmers. In 1880, in the Muscle Slough conflict, railroad agents and farmers got into a shootout over land rights. 7 people died. The railroad company had claimed land that farmers had been living on and improving for years. The farmers were prosecuted. The railroad company faced no consequences. Why? Because the railroad owners, the Big Four, controlled California politics. They owned newspapers, they owned politicians, they owned judges, they owned the system. The farmers owned nothing but their labor and their lives, and the system took both. Chinese immigrants faced systematic violence with no legal protection. They were assaulted, robbed, sometimes killed. Chinese victims couldn't testify in court against white people, so attackers faced no consequences. Why this law? Because white business owners wanted to keep Chinese labor cheap and powerless. Legal protection would have given them power, so the law specifically denied them protection. The people who owned California designed the legal system to protect their ownership and their power. If you were wealthy, the courts protected your property. The police protected your interests. The law worked for you. If you were poor, the courts took your property. The police intimidated you. The law oppressed you. Justice wasn't blind. Justice served the owners. For women, children, and immigrants, the question of who owned California was answered brutally, not them. Women legally couldn't own much of anything. If you were married, your property belonged to your husband. Your wages belonged to your husband. You couldn't enter contracts independently. You couldn't vote or serve on juries. You were property more than property owner. This meant your survival depended on men, usually men who owned things. If you married a wealthy landowner, you lived comfortably, but you owned nothing. He did. If you married a poor laborer, you lived in poverty and still owned nothing. If you were unmarried or widowed, your options were terrible. Jobs for women paid starvation wages. You could be a domestic servant, a laundress, a seamstress. The wages weren't enough to survive independently. Many women became prostitutes out of economic necessity, and prostitution showed the ownership structure clearly. Brothels were owned by madames or male owners. They took most of the money. The prostitutes kept almost nothing. The buildings were owned by wealthy landlords who charged enormous rent because they knew brothels made money. The police were paid by brothel owners to provide protection from competitors and from laws they selectively enforced. Politicians received money from the prostitution industry. Everyone owned a piece of the system except the women actually doing the work. They owned nothing, not their earnings, not their bodies, not their futures. They were exploited by every level of the ownership structure. Children were property too. Wealthy children inherited their families, land, businesses, and power. They owned California's future. Poor children owned nothing and inherited nothing. They worked from young ages in mines, in factories, on farms. Child labor was legal and common. Children as young as 7 or 8 did dangerous work for minimal pay. They died in workplace accidents. They developed health problems from hard labor. They received no education. Why? Because the people who owned the mines and factories and farms wanted cheap labor. Children were the cheapest. Laws could have protected children, but the lawmakers were controlled by the business owners who profited from child labor. So children remained unprotected, exploitable, owned by the system. Immigrants faced the most systematic exclusion from ownership. Chinese immigrants built California. They mined gold. They built the railroads, they worked farms, they built levees, they were essential labor, but they were specifically prevented from owning California. The foreign miners tax targeted Chinese miners. It charged them monthly fees that white miners didn't pay. It drove them out of mining or into poverty. Why? Because white mining companies wanted to eliminate Chinese competition and force Chinese men into cheap wage labor. Chinese immigrants couldn't become citizens. They couldn't vote. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't own land in many areas. Every law was designed to keep them as labor without allowing them to become owners. The railroads imported thousands of Chinese workers to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They did the most dangerous work. They died in massive numbers, from explosions, avalanches, accidents. They were paid half what white workers made. When the railroad was finished, the Chinese workers owned nothing. They'd built the infrastructure that made the railroad barons wealthy, but they received only subsistence wages. The railroad barons, Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, Crocker, became some of America's richest men. The Chinese workers who actually built the railroad owned nothing. Mexican Californians lost the land their families had owned for generations. Through legal manipulation, through violence, through a system designed to transfer their land to American speculators. They went from landowners to laborers on land that used to be theirs. Women couldn't own, children couldn't own, immigrants couldn't own. Mexican Californians lost what they'd owned. The only people who owned California were wealthy white men who'd accumulated capital and used it to grab resources and control the legal system. Everyone else worked to make them wealthier. That was the structure, clear, deliberate, enforced by law and violence. California wasn't owned by the people who lived there, who worked there, who built it. It was owned by an elite who'd rigged every system to concentrate ownership in their hands. The darkest example of who owned California came with the railroad. The Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collies Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, built the Central Pacific Railroad with massive federal subsidies. The government gave them millions in loans, 11 million acres of land, rights of way, subsidies per mile of track. This was public wealth transferred to private individuals, and they used it to create the most powerful monopoly California had ever seen. By the 1870s, the Big Four controlled California completely. They controlled transportation, all railroads and most shipping. They controlled land, millions of acres they could sell or rent. They controlled politics. They owned newspapers, financed politicians, bribed legislators. They controlled the economy. Every business depended on their railroads to move goods. They literally owned California's government. The state legislature was called the Railroad Legislature because everyone knew the railroad controlled it. Legislators voted however the Big Four wanted. Laws were written to benefit the railroad. The governor, often a railroad man or railroad-backed candidate. Judges, many appointed by railroad-controlled governors or elected with railroad money. This was complete oligarchic control, and they used it brutally. They charged farmers extortionate shipping rates. Farmers had no alternatives. Pay the railroad or your crops rotted. They grabbed land through legal technicalities. They'd claim land under federal grants, then evict settlers who'd been living there for years. When people protested, the railroad used its political power to crush them. When farmers organized, the railroad-controlled newspapers smeared them. When workers struck, railroad-controlled police broke the strikes. The Muscle Slough tragedy in 1880 showed this at its worst. The railroad claimed land in the Central Valley that settlers had been farming for years. The settlers had improved the land, built homes, planted crops. They'd been promised they could buy the land at low prices. The railroad decided to charge much higher prices. The settlers couldn't afford it. The railroad sent agents to evict them. A confrontation turned violent. 7 people died. The railroad used its political power to prosecute the settlers. The railroad faced no consequences. This is what complete ownership looked like. The Big Four owned the land, the courts, the legislature. The governor, the newspapers, the economy, they owned California. and they used that ownership to extract maximum wealth from everyone else. Farmers paid extortionate rates. Workers received minimal wages. Competitors were crushed. Politicians did what they were told. The Big Four became some of the wealthiest men in American history. Everyone else paid them, worked for them, enriched them. This was the logical endpoint of concentrated ownership. When a few men own all the critical infrastructure and control the government, they don't just have power. They are the power. They are the state. That was California in the railroad era, owned by 4 men, operated for their benefit. Everyone else was just labor and customers in their private empire. So what changed? Who owns California now? Honestly, it's complicated. California is no longer openly controlled by a handful of oligarchs the way it was in the 1800s. We have democratic institutions that function imperfectly, but they function. We have regulations that limit monopolies. We have land ownership more widely distributed. You can own property. You can vote. You have legal rights. That's progress, real progress. But let's be honest, ownership and power are still concentrated. California's land is expensive, among the most expensive in America. Home ownership is out of reach for many people. Wealth inequality is extreme. A small percentage of people own the majority of valuable property and control the majority of wealth. Tech billionaires, real estate moguls, financial executives, entertainment industry elites. They don't control California the way the Big Four did. They can't buy legislators quite as openly. They can't operate quite as brazenly, but they have enormous influence through campaign contributions, through lobbying, through wealth that buys access to power. So ownership is less concentrated than 1870, but it's still concentrated. The difference is, in the 1800s, if you were a regular person, you had almost zero chance of ever owning significant property or building wealth. The system was designed to prevent it. Today, it's difficult, really difficult, especially in California, but it's possible. Some people do build businesses, do buy property, do accumulate wealth. Not many, not easily, but some. That's the improvement. You're not legally prevented from ownership the way Chinese immigrants were. You're not systematically dispossessed the way Mexican landowners were. You're not exploited quite as brutally as 19th century workers were. You have labor protections, minimum wage, safety regulations, legal rights. The owners can't treat you as disposable property anymore. But make no mistake, California is still a place where ownership determines power, where wealth determines opportunity, where being born with capital gives you massive advantages. It's better than it was, but it's not equal. The question, who owns California, still has the same basic answer: not most people. Just fewer people are completely excluded now, and the mechanisms of control are more subtle. That's progress, I guess. But when you see how absolutely and brutally ownership determined everything in early California, you understand why we should keep fighting for broader distribution of ownership and power. That's what you need to understand. Early California was owned by a small elite who grabbed control of land, resources, infrastructure, and government. They didn't build California through hard work. They built it through manipulation, corruption, legal maneuvering, and violence. They designed systems specifically to concentrate ownership in their hands and prevent everyone else from ever owning anything. Miners found gold that made merchants and bankers wealthy. Workers built railroads that made the Big Four wealthy. Farmers grew crops that made landowners and shipping companies wealthy. Immigrants did dangerous labor that made industrial owners wealthy. The people who actually did the work owned nothing. The people who owned the systems extracted all the wealth. This wasn't accidental. This was designed. Early California proved that ownership is power, that controlling resources means controlling people, that wealth creates more wealth while poverty creates more poverty. Yes, things have improved. You have rights your ancestors didn't have. You have protections workers fought and died to win. But the fundamental dynamic, ownership equals power, hasn't disappeared. It's just evolved. Understanding how brutally this worked in early California helps you understand how power and ownership function today, and helps you appreciate the rights you do have. Because people in early California had almost none. They worked, they suffered, they died, and they owned nothing. Thank God you don't live in that system. If this documentary opened your eyes to how ownership really worked in early America, check out our other state documentaries. Each one reveals a different aspect of how brutal our history actually was, because understanding the past helps us build a better future.